So, the title of my talk has already been mentioned. I will try in this talk to show what lies beyond Linnaeus's work on the order of nature, as it is usually put, but also how his conception of the order of nature enabled this beyond. So Linnaeus, as we all know him, came to fame in the 18th century in Holland through the publication of his Systema Naturae, 1735. You see here a much used portrait of him as a professor in Uppsala. While in Holland, he also put together another famous work, Hortus Cliffortianus, a catalogue of a huge plant collection put together by one of the directors of the Dutch East India Company and the rich merchant banker George Clifford. All of this usually is what encapsulates Linnaeus to people. He, of course, continued to work on this big project of a world catalogue of plants, but also animals. Species Plantarum is sort of the starting point of modern taxonomy. Systema Naturae appeared and reappeared in all in 12 editions during Linnaeus's lifetime and grew very much in volume. There is a long tradition of reducing Linnaeus to his taxonomy. I have to apologize to those with historical sensibilities. I just have no better word for taxonomy. It didn't exist in the 18th century. I'm just referring to this project of naming and classifying organisms with that handy word that came into being in the 19th century. There's a long tradition of reducing Linnaeus to this project as portraying him obsessed with classification and not really interested in biological problems. And that often resulted in making him really a straw man, a proponent of a form of science that life scientists do not want. That starts with Julius Sachs' magisterial Geschichte der Botanik, History of Botany, published at the end of the 19th century. Sachs himself was a physiologist, wanted to ground scientific botany in physiological experimentation, biochemistry, etc. Linnaeus for him was a useful foil to portray what he considered to be merely descriptive, dull systematics that lay people and some scientists still engaged in. The story continues with the so-called modern synthesis in the mid-20th century, when Darwin and Mendel came together to in a reformulation of evolutionary theory. Here the big divide was between typological thinking, exemplified by Linnaeus, versus population thinking in terms of population. And Linnaeus became an Aristotelian, a Platonist sometimes even of some kind in this historiography. Someone belonging to the past that modern evolutionary biology has overcome. And there is more recently a lot of literature sort of in the in the wake of post-colonialism. Londa Schiebinger has written about this, Baru Subramaniam, Botany of Empire, a recent book came out last year, that shows Linnaeus's project of cataloging life as a form of appropriating and extracting nature outside of Europe. Londa Schiebinger speaks of linguistic imperialism. And here again, what Linnaeus did was reduce to his taxonomy. This point of view has recently been epitomized in a more popular book by Jason Roberts, Every Living Thing, that won the Pulitzer Prize, that contrasts Linnaeus and his contemporary Georges Buffon in France, and I quote from this book, "To Linnaeus's mind, nature was a noun, a thing to be named and catalogued. All species remained as created during Genesis, representing an unchanging tableau. To Buffon, nature was a verb, a swirl of constant change." Now, the aims of my talk are not apologetic. Rather, I want to ask what happens if we choose a different starting point for looking at Linnaeus, not his stay in Holland and the suite of taxonomic works he published there, but another episode, his trip to Lapland in 1732, that shows him grounded in the world and investigative rather than contemplative and sort of imposing order onto the world. It is often maintained that he never published his diary from this journey to Lapland, but this, as we will see, is not entirely true. Flora Laponica was published in 1737, and it contains many extracts from his journal. He continued his interest in local nature in journeys throughout various Swedish provinces and patriotic works like Fauna Svekica. The first edition appeared in 1746. And the experience in Lapland also shaped his ecological and medical thinking, as I will show in quite some detail, especially his unpublished work in dietetics. But it also shaped his cameralism with his hope for transplanting plants globally that has so beautifully been explored by Lisbeth Körner in her book Linnaeus, Nature and Nation, and which was geared towards his own home country, explaining his lifelong interest in horticulture, agriculture, and more generally, the reproduction of living beings. In the following, I will start with some basics of Linnaeus' systematic botany and then explore three areas of interest to Linnaeus that not only complemented his taxonomic project, or were side by side with it in a way, but were conceptually entangled with it. These three areas of interest are the economy of nature, generation or reproduction, and finally, anthropology, or what I call in the title, the human condition. For each of these areas, I aim to show how Linnaeus's new taxonomy enabled new perspectives that anachronistically we might indeed want to address as biological. Linnaeus' taxonomic principles were laid down in a preface to Genera Plantarum, one of the many taxonomic works that Linnaeus published in Holland in 1737, but one which is generally overlooked in the literature, and especially the preface that explains the principles on the basis of which Linnaeus wanted to proceed with his taxonomic project. I won't bore you with the Latin any further. Here's the English translation of some key passages from this preface. And what emerges from this is that the cornerstone of Linnaeus's taxonomy is not his system, but his concept of species, which he defined, addressed as natural. Species are natural, as he called it, on the basis that individuals always produce individuals of the same species, according to what he termed laws of generation, leges generationis. Species, that is, were not defined by their appearance, but rather by reproductive relationships. In Linnaeus's case, by descent. Buffon has another alternative, but I won't talk about Buffon in any detail here. So whatever individuals descend from one of the organisms originally created by God in the beginning of time belong to the same species. No matter, one might add, what they look like. Genera, curiously, are likewise addressed as natural by Linnaeus. And by genera, he understands groups of species. So species classified, if you want. And again, the emphasis is not placed on particular shared properties, as he explains with reference to examples from zoology, So he does a kind of thought experiment. What if a horse and pig were one-hooved? We would still not classify them as one genus. Yeah, but the usual definition uh, uh, um, uh, um, the usual definitions operating with respect to animals would force us to do such a move. It's a complicated argument that is behind here, but I hope the basic point comes across. So it's again a methodology that rests on treating species as ultimate units, which need to be compared carefully to lead to larger groupings like genera based on overall similarity. Traditional methods based on division by genus and specific difference, in contrast, tend to tear apart such groupings. That's what he explains here in the aphorism numbered 8. And it is quite clear from this that Linnaeus opts for what we nowadays would call a bottom-up method of grouping on the basis of comparison and description of species. Now let's take a little step back and investigate the stark differences between these two kinds of sorting things out, as one could call it. On the right-hand side of this, no, the left-hand side of this slide, we have the traditional way of classifying or creating order in nature. The division per genus et differentiam, which results in a linear hierarchy or a scale of nature. The result is a logic of disjunction measuring out a linear scale of presences and absences, perfection and privation, whose point it is precisely to also admit intermediate stages. It is based, this way of creating order is based on a transitive relation of perfection and privation. And Linnaeus played with this methodology in his so-called sexual system, which he always called artificial. It was not what the natural system was about, that he had in mind in Genera Plantarum. And he actually, in a way, makes fun of it. There's a long story to be told about this that I have to skip here. Linnaeus' bottom-up procedure, in contrast, uses conjunctions of characters. So it looks at many characters at once, many properties at once. And these may include negations and disjunctions. So it may be characteristic of a genus or an order that it has a certain property in alternatives, so to speak, yeah? That it is either, that the plant is either dioicous or monoicous. He himself gives examples for that. So this is results in a partition of space by inclusion and exclusion. It is based on a relation of equivalence, an important point to which we will come back later. While classes form a hierarchy of ranks here, logically at least, there's no sense in which one can speak of a higher or lower rank as one can in the division per genus et differentiam. Linnaean taxonomy is hence involved a fundamental inversion of ontology that takes it out of the age-old realism debate in philosophy. Classification is not something conceptual in the first place, but it is practical. It consists in the actual sorting of things. Species, genera, orders, classes are not abstract concepts, but concrete entities that need to be described, more like bits of a landscape. And Linnaeus's genus descriptions are actually quite long descriptions, and he calls them descriptions, not definitions. And the analogy, like with bits of landscape, is also present in Linnaeus himself. Linnaeus repeatedly used analogies of mapping to describe what he was doing. Classification being an actual sorting of things is also reflected in the understanding of names and classes that evolved from this perspective that Linnaeus took in. Names became increasingly reduced to mere labels, and the introduction of binomial nomenclature with species plantarum is a wonderful example of that, where names are really nothing. The trivial names, as Linnaeus called them, are nothing but labels. And classes are really containers. A genus is defined by the species it contains. It reflects sort of the organization of collections. Now, let's turn to the economy of nature in a first step, the concept that Linnaeus used to cover phenomena we would today address as ecological, and see how this relates to his taxonomic view of nature. The concept was laid down in a famous essay, in fact, a dissertation, but these dissertations were usually authored by Linnaeus for his students, who paid a handsome sum for this, and published in 1749. And this is an essay in contrast to Systema Naturae or Genera Plantarum that was still involved in lively discussion among 19th century naturalists. For example, Charles Lyell mentions it in his Principles of Geology, and also Charles Darwin still thinks this is a text that one can take seriously and discuss at length. So whereas Linnaeus's taxonomy had become a practical tool that was taken for granted and not really discussed. Now, Linnaeus formulated his economy of nature in a very curious way, distinguishing between two kinds of relations that sort of uphold the economy of nation. He refers to them in Latin with the terms series and nexus. Series comprises the diachronic succession of individuals as a result of the reproduction of their reproduction. So in fact, the term was used by Linnaeus in Systema Naturae 1735 to describe the succession of reproducing individuals that defines species. I explained his species concept earlier. Nexus is a term from contract theory, and it implies mutual obligation, and it comprises the synchronic relations of destruction and restitution of individuals, i.e. that individuals consume other individuals in order to nourish and reproduce themselves. So they are trophic relations, as we would say nowadays. This has the curious result that in Linnaeus's economy of nature, balance or proportion among species, a theme since antiquity and in natural philosophy, is not just upheld by proportionate relations of consumption and production. That's how the ancient tradition had it, but ultimately by a third process, propagation, or the production of offspring. So it's more like a tetragon. The relationships. It starts with Eden, where you have God created individual organisms. And then Eden, the Garden of Paradise, which is located on a mountainous island, grows by accretion. The habitable earth grows, and through the processes, the threefold processes of propagation, preservation, and destruction, we get the current species distribution around the world. Linnaeus was convinced that the reproduction of species was governed by laws. I mentioned that already, i.e. that each species reproduces with a specific rate. It is this rate of reproduction that ensures that individuals lost in the consumption by others are replenished, ensuring not only their own reproduction, but also that of their predators. Yeah? So everything depends on the precise number of offspring an individual produces within a species, on the rate of reproduction. Now, this has two consequences in Linnaeus's economy of nature. First, relations between different species are specific. Each species has its predators and parasites that are specific to itself, and likewise, each species thrives on specific prey and hosts. The second consequence is that the existence of species diversity is contingent on the stability of extremely finely balanced reproductive rates. Variation in this rate would immediately lead to the destruction of one species by another. It's very curious to see that this is something Linnaeus does not really realize. He has a complete blind spot there. But it is, of course, something that is later taken up in the Malthusian moment in the history of natural history around 1800. Let us look at one example that may well have influenced Linnaeus's thinking about the economy of nature profoundly, and that I've recently published on. The reindeer warble fly, probably an insect not many of you have heard of. First, a description of the relationship of this parasitic fly to reindeer was published in Flora Laponica in 1737, and it describes the relationship between these two animals as sympathy, in terms of sympathy and antipathy, and sympathy and antipathy as sort of apportioned to these two animals through God's wisdom, and in establishing a kind of balance between their mutual drives, so to speak. The warble fly loves the reindeer, in Linnaeus's words. It follows it everywhere, even into cold regions, up high in mountains where it can hardly fly, since it needs to drop its eggs on it for them to develop under their skin, which provides a warm winter home, as Linnaeus puts it, for the young of the fly. The reindeer, in contrast, and quite obviously, abhors the insect. It moves in specific ways to avoid the fly, to shake its eggs off, and it migrates towards the snowfields that cover the mountains, where it's too cold for the fly to follow it, and so that it avoids the damage that this fly can cause to its own reproduction. And Linnaeus is quite clear in manuscripts. There's a variety of manuscripts about that this relationship between the reindeer warblefly and the reindeer is a specific one. That is, similar parasitic flies you find among cattle in the south of Sweden are actually of a very different species, just as their host is of a different species. So that's an important point for him. In a letter to the English gardener Philip Miller, Linnaeus also develops the idea of a balance here, that there's a kind of balance between the ability of the reindeer to escape the fly and the fly to follow it in its love and for the reindeer. Linnaeus develops this idea to the point where he claims in this letter that the whole of Sami reindeer husbandry entirely depends on the fly actually herding the reindeer into the mountains. So this is quite a spectacular theory that came out here. Now, attentive listeners may have noted something peculiar. Why is an insect described in Flora Laponica? Flora Laponica is a catalogue of all the plants in Lapland. In fact, Linnaeus integrates his description of Oestrum rangiferum rhinum laponicum, of the reindeer warblefly, in his chapter on mushrooms that grow in Lapland. Why? Because that chapter starts with the observation that each mushroom species offers itself for flies to lay their eggs in, but also each mushroom species is poisonous to particular flies. And that is why the Sami use mushrooms and burn them to keep warblefly and other parasitic insects away from their reindeer. So this is described in this chapter. Now, the Sami also use dogs to herd reindeer against their will, um, uh, uh, against their will to, or their wish to escape the reindeer warblefly, to keep them together in order to milk them, etc. And finally, in an essay on the reindeer from 1754, Linnaeus also adds the observations that sometimes crows will remove maggots from the back of reindeer. So what we have here is a fully fledged multi-species economy, as we would say nowadays, a really dense web of relations that are all in one way or other finely balanced to allow for the reproduction of species. Now, this takes me to the next subject. Sorry. No, sorry. I was jumping ahead. Okay, so Linnaeus finally publishes all these things that I've been talking about in a long essay in the first volume of the Royal Academy of Science, the transactions of the Royal Academy of Science in Stockholm, the Academy of Science that he co-founded with six other countrymen in 1739. It's a wonderful essay with a lot of literary qualities that unfortunately only come across for those who read Swedish and Gothic script. That constitutes a kind of new genre in the history of natural history. It describes the full life history of this insect, the reindeer warblefly. It actually empathizes with this fly. It takes in its perspectives and goes through its development from egg to maggot under the skin of reindeer to the fully developed imago. But also along the way describes how the reindeer behave to avoid infestation, how humans prevent and treat infestations, etc., etc. Contains amazing observations of interactions between gadflies, reindeer, and reindeer herders. For example, that reindeer are reluctant to go where they are led to if this means walking with the wind. Yeah, they usually walk against the wind to avoid these insects. And Linnaeus also adds observation on the damage caused and possible measures against the gadfly. But at the center of it is the life history of a noxious insect. And this takes me to the next subject, the subject of generation and reproduction. Linnaeus' description of the reindeer warblefly's life history encapsulates his conception of generation not as an isolated event, but as a continuous process. This is reflected in the first four paragraphs of Systema Naturae, in which he lays down what most scholars have interpreted as the principles of his species fixism. Again, an English translation. In these first four aphorisms in Systema Naturae, Linnaeus emphasizes that every living being arises from an egg, and which means there is no spontaneous generation, and that there are no new species. This is often seen as a statement against the possibility of species change. But note that the life history of the warblefly includes massive changes in the morphology of this insect. In fact, it is Linnaeus' repeated statement that there are no new species are statements against the possibility of any form of transmutation, as one should call it. Linnaeus, that is, argues against equivocal generation in these paragraphs, that an individual belonging to a particular species can produce another individual belonging to a different species. For example, a maggot, a fly. Yeah? The generation of living beings is held within limits by laws of generation. Here the term comes up again, which not only include the principle that like produces like, but also determines the timing of generation within the seasonal cycle, something that Linnaeus is very interested in, the calendar of flora. The specific means by which organisms reproduce, something that he calls mechanismus in the original, and that is translated here as principles. Specific susceptibility to environmental factors, the constitution of a species, and the fact that individuals recognize each other as belonging to particular species, as potential mating partners, but also as prey or as predators or as parasites and hosts. So what he refers to as what is referred to here as sensations. If this is all a bit obscure in Systema Naturae, Philosophia Botanica from 1751 is very clear about it, wrongly acknowledging Harvey as a precursor, but very clearly stating that generation, this is on the last line on the left hand, nova creatio nulla, sed continuata generatio. Generation is something that is continued throughout the life of an individual organism. And he thinks of plant development in a clear analogy to insect development, actually, with the flower being sort of the imago of the plant, the adult state of the plant. And he develops from that, again in Philosophia Botanica, the idea of a metamorphosis of plants, which was later picked up by Goethe. Very much already the alles ist Blatt theory that Goethe also formulates. Now, Linnaeus's first article in the Transactions of the Royal Academy of Sciences in Stockholm, an article that actually precedes the one on the reindeer warblefly, was about plant reproduction. It was entitled Rön om växternas om växters plantering, so experiences or from the plantation of plants. And it was making the point, this essay, that while gardeners have the mean to provoke all sorts of changes in plants by physically manipulating their environment, that's actually what a gardener does and is good at, these changes always remain within limits of what he calls laws of generation, and which it is the task of the botanist to investigate. So he's introducing a kind of division of labor here between gardeners and botanists, who are the experts of laws of generation, of outlining the limits to which that are posed to what the gardener can do with plants. Another dissertation from 1757 polemicized against a still very popular theory during the time of Linnaeus, which endorsed the possibility of changing various species of grain, barley, oats, wheat, into each other by taking certain agricultural measures. This is again a theory that goes all the way back to antiquity. Now, does all of this preclude species change? Developmental change is very much at the heart of Linnaeus's understanding of reproduction, after all, as we've seen. I think one can raise this question. And indeed, as some of you may very well know, species change was indeed conceivable to Linnaeus, as long as it did fit the frame of thinking in terms of laws of generation. So from the mid-1750s onwards, Linnaeus entertains the idea that new species can arise from hybridization. And he wins a prize competition by the St. Petersburg Academy. On the right-hand side, there is a manuscript. It was later published as an essay. He wins a prize competition with his essay, which produces the results from an experiment he conducted in hybridizing and producing a new species. He actually sent in the seeds of this species as well. And this produced a whole line of experimentation by people like Kohlreuter, Gärtner, and other 19th century naturalists that leads right up to Mendel. There's even some material continuity because Kohlreuter used the seeds that Linnaeus had sent to St. Petersburg, and even Gärtner may have had access to plants that came from these seeds through Kohlreuter. Now, Linnaeus framed his speculations about hybridization by a peculiar physiological theory, the medulla cortex theory, that is based on the idea that plants, but also animals, that their bodies are basically composed of two fundamental substances, the medulla and the cortex. The medulla being responsible for growth or expansion, the cortex being responsible for nutrition and thereby shaping that growth, bringing that growth into form. Again, one can say a lot of things here. This theory also informs the work that he was most proud of, Clavis Medicinae Duplex, published in 1766, so very, very late in his life. This work leads us deep into Linnaeus's eclectic natural philosophy and medicine, which was entirely materialist, yet also highly idiosyncratic. So one of the big influences for him was actually Santorini, as was shown by a very nice article by Luciana Costa Lima Thomas in a volume that Fabrizio co-edited. On a more mundane level, this physiological theory underwrote Linnaeus's dietetics, which had its original starting point in the idea that it is the animal nature of the human species that must be considered in defining a healthy lifestyle and success in producing offspring. And these lectures were enormously popular, but for their naturalistic description of sexuality in particular, I guess were never published. I guess Linnaeus refrained for that reason from that. It wasn't also clearly in his remit, in the remit of his chair. This brings us to my last topic, on which I will not spend that much time, obviously, because most of my time has elapsed. Linnaeus's anthropology. The mapping impulse that I have described for his general taxonomic project was also behind his classification of mankind into 4 human varieties, as he called them. In Systema Naturae, he distinguished these primarily according to geographic origin, European, American, Asian, African, but decisively adding skin color as a trait that allegedly correlated with geographic origin. Now, there was what was really new about this classification? Well, there was a twofold. There are two things to be said about that. There's not only the correlation of geographic origin with skin color, but also the integration of this distinction within the hierarchical order of nature. All 4 human varieties belong to the same human species. This human species, in turn, was the only species of the genus Homo, which belongs to the order of human-like animals, anthropomorpha, alongside apes and sloths. And the anthropomorpha, in turn, were one of the orders of the class of 4-footed animals. So that's the Linnaean hierarchy that I already explained, and into which humans are fully integrated. But note that there is a different sense of hierarchy that Linnaeus' classification of humans might suggest, not the so-called Linnaean hierarchy of species, genera, orders, classes, and kingdoms, but the equally hierarchical but linear order of the scale of nature. So one could think that the Europeans are on the top of the list because they are the highest form of humans. Now, there are several indications that this second reading at least needs a lot of qualifications. First of all, Linnaeus was very clear again in a work on botany, Critica Botanica, that all differences among humans are accidental and should not be taken as differences that justify splitting them into distinct species. And he emphasizes that humans vary in many other respects, skin color and complexion being only one of them, and on a par with differences in hair color, facial features, body stature and body weight, and even disabilities. Yet Linnaeus continued to reproduce his linear or scalar hierarchy of human varieties in a more elaborate classification of the human species in the 10th edition of Systema Naturae of 1758. Alongside physical characters here, like eye color, hair color, and form, facial features like the shape of the nose, and comportment, he lists the medical temperament as an important property that varies with relation to human varieties, psychological attitudes, clothing that these different varieties wear or do not wear, and the form of governments. So Americans are governed by custom, Europeans by fashions, Asians by opinions, and Africans by the will of others, arbitrio. Now, many of these descriptions express racial prejudices, but note that now it is the American that is at the top, where Linnaeus sort of engages idea of the noble savage, endorses ideas of the noble savage, and has deviated from his original arrangement. If one turns to his anthropological manuscripts, one can see that he experiments with all sorts of linear arrangements. There are manuscripts where the Asians are at the top. There are manuscripts where the Americans are at the bottom. And I was just now in Växjö in Sweden and saw notes from lectures Linnaeus gave where the Africans are at the top. So one finds nearly any combination. So the linear arrangement does not seem to have mattered that much to Linnaeus, or at least it was a subject for him one could play around with. He was not committed to a historical developmental reading of this linear nature. Now this again changes in 1760. Linnaeus publishes a curious essay called Anthropomorpha, Human-likes, in which he discusses other human-like beings, primates. We see here on this famous illustration to this work, on the right-hand side, the orangutan, the chimpanzee, and then two largely imagined species, which Linnaeus strikingly classifies as members of the genus Homo. So there is not only one human species for Linnaeus, there is at least potentially room for several human species. Now, what would suggest to address them as human? Linnaeus is very clear that there is no anatomical difference that differentiates humans from apes. For him, the difference consists in humans possessing rationality. And in his discussion of these additional human species that might exist, it becomes clear that the defining criterion for him is the ability to communicate and trade. If there are other human species that we can talk to, they are clearly human. Yeah, that's the point here. This is, from today's perspective, perhaps the strangest aspect of Linnaeus's taxonomy. Now it's more or less an interesting taboo of modernity that there might be other human species. We're monospecific. We're committed to monospecific specificity of the human species, so to speak, or the human genus. This is an interesting point perhaps to end on. And that's what I'm going to do. I leave you with this image of Linnaeus from Linnaeus's own copy of Species Plantarum. Behind this catalog of species, it's actually Genera Plantarum. Behind this catalog of all the plant genera of the world, there lies a world of detail that I've only touched upon, but it is really quite closely entangled with his taxonomic project. Okay, thank you very much.